You are standing in the eastern desert of Egypt, roughly 3,200 years before the Common Era. The sun is white. The sand radiates heat in waves you can feel through your sandals. And you are holding a rock. It is heavier than it should be. Heavier than the limestone you build with, heavier than the flint you cut with. It has a strange dark surface, pitted and scarred, as if something enormous had gripped it and let go. Where the sand has worn it smooth, it gleams, not like copper, not like gold, but with a cold gray light you have never seen in any material pulled from the earth. You did not dig this up. You found it lying on the surface, half buried, as if it had been dropped from an impossible height. You do not know where it came from. You do not know what it is. You have no word for it. Nobody does. What you are holding fell from the sky. It is a fragment of an iron-nickel meteorite, and it contains a metal that will take your civilization 3,000 years to learn how to extract from the ground. For now, it is a curiosity, a gift from the gods. For the next 30 centuries, that is the only iron Egypt will ever touch. Ancient Egypt lasted over 3,000 years. In that time, they built the pyramids, developed surgical medicine, mapped the stars, administered a continental empire, and traded with civilizations from Mesopotamia to Nubia to the Aegean. They mastered copper. They mastered bronze. They mastered gold. They worked with glass, faience, stone, and wood with a precision that still embarrasses modern replicators. And in all that time, across all those centuries of staggering technical achievement, they never figured out how to make iron from the ground beneath their feet. Not once. So how did ancient Egyptians discover iron? The answer covers more than 3,000 years, at least 4 civilizations, a catastrophic collapse that nearly ended the Bronze Age world, and one of the most important accidents in the history of technology. It starts not with a forge or a furnace, but with a rock that fell from space, and it ends with the metal that holds up every building you have ever entered. Let's start with what came before, because for most of Egyptian history, the answer to what is the strongest metal available was not iron, it was bronze. Bronze is an alloy, roughly 90% copper and 10% tin, melted together, and it is genuinely excellent. It melts at a manageable temperature, around 950 degrees Celsius, which means you can cast it into almost any shape. A blade, a chisel, an arrowhead, a fitting for a chariot wheel, a mirror, a surgical instrument. It holds a reasonable edge. It is predictable. If you are running a civilization and you need a reliable metal for your military, your construction, and your trade, bronze is an outstanding answer. Egypt had copper. The Sinai Peninsula, just east of the Nile Delta, was one of the richest copper sources in the ancient world. Egyptian mining expeditions to Sinai date back to at least the early dynastic period, roughly 3,100 BCE. Paul Craddock, a metallurgist at the British Museum, published a comprehensive study in 1995 called Early Metal Mining and Production that documented how Egyptian copper smelting at sites like Timna and Wadi Fainan was among the most sophisticated in the ancient world. But bronze requires tin, and Egypt has almost no tin. Think about what that means for an entire civilization's infrastructure. Every bronze blade, every bronze fitting, every bronze tool in Egypt depended on tin imported from hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. From Afghanistan, from Cornwall, from Anatolia, passed through a chain of Levantine intermediaries. The entire Egyptian Bronze Age was built on a supply chain that stretched across the known world. And that supply chain worked brilliantly. The tomb of Rekhmir, vizier under Thutmose III at Thebes, contains painted scenes of metalworkers casting bronze doors and vessels in organized workshops, a level of industrial coordination that would not look out of place in a modern foundry. That is exactly why Egypt never needed iron. Bronze did everything they asked. It was reliable, castable, repairable, and beautiful. There was no reason to experiment with the dull, stubborn ore in the hills of the eastern desert, until there was. The oldest iron artifacts in Egypt did not come from a mine. They came from the sky. In 1911, archaeologists excavating a pre-dynastic cemetery at Gerzeh, about 70 kilometers south of Cairo, found 9 small tubular beads made from a metal that should not have existed in Egypt at that date, roughly 3,200 BCE, a full 2,000 years before any evidence of iron smelting anywhere in the world. For a century, nobody could explain them. Then in 2013, Diane Johnson, a meteorite scientist at the Open University in the United Kingdom, published a study using scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy to analyze the Gerzeh beads. The results were definitive. The beads contained high concentrations of nickel, between 10 and 30%, along with traces of cobalt, phosphorus, and germanium. That chemical signature is impossible in terrestrial iron. It is the fingerprint of an iron-nickel meteorite. Think about what that means for the discovery of iron. The first Egyptians to work with iron did not discover it. They picked it up. It was already finished, dense, hard, metallic, lying on the desert surface where it had fallen. They hammered it into beads, rolled them into tubes, and strung them alongside gold. That is not metallurgy, that is collection. The Egyptians had a name for this metal. They called it Bia-npt, iron of the sky. That phrase tells you everything. It is not a geological term. It is not the name of an ore body or a mining region. It is a description of origin. The metal came from above. It belonged to the gods. In the pyramid texts, among the oldest religious writings in human history, carved into the walls of royal tombs at Saqqara, the bones of the pharaoh in the afterlife are described as iron, celestial, indestructible, eternal. Here is the detail that matters for our story. The Egyptians had no reason to believe iron existed in the ground. Every piece of iron they had ever encountered had arrived from the sky. The idea that you could dig the same metal from a hillside, that the dull red ore in the eastern desert was the same substance as the gleaming meteorite on the pharaoh's thigh, would have been, to an Egyptian metalworker, incomprehensible. Iron was not a material, it was a miracle. And bronze was everywhere. By the mid-second millennium BCE, Egyptian bronze production was industrial. The mines at Serabit el-Qadim in the Sinai employed hundreds of workers in organized royal expeditions. Copper flowed west to the smelting sites in the delta. Tin arrived from the east through a network of Levantine merchants that connected Egypt to sources as far away as Afghanistan and possibly Cornwall. T. Stech and R. Madden, metallurgists at the University of Pennsylvania, published a study in 1985 analyzing late Bronze Age copper alloys from across the eastern Mediterranean. Their finding: tin content had become remarkably standardized at 8 to 12% across hundreds of analyzed artifacts, from Egypt to Greece to the Levant. That is not folk metallurgy. That is quality control on a continental scale. Bronze melts at around 950 degrees Celsius. You can pour it into a mold and cast a sword blade, an arrowhead, or a mirror in a single pour. It holds a functional edge. If it chips, you reheat it. If it breaks, you melt it down and recast it. Recycling is built into the material. Think about what that means for the discovery of iron. Why would any Egyptian metalworker experiment with an unknown ore that requires 1,200 degrees, 250 degrees hotter than bronze? When bronze already works, they wouldn't. And for over 1,000 years, they didn't. In 1925, when Howard Carter's team finished cataloging the treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, sealed since approximately 1323 BCE, they found, strapped to the young pharaoh's right thigh, an iron dagger. It should not have been there. Iron artifacts from 14th century Egypt are extraordinarily rare. The blade was not rusted. It was not corroded. After more than 3,000 years in a sealed chamber, it looked almost new. For decades, the dagger's origin was debated. Some scholars argued it was a gift from the Hittites of Anatolia, perhaps produced by experimental smelting. Others proposed it had been imported from the kingdom of Mitanni. The question mattered because the answer would tell us whether anyone in the eastern Mediterranean had mastered iron smelting by the 14th century BCE. In 2016, Daniela Comelli, a physicist at the Polytechnic University of Milan, published a study in the journal Meteoritics and Planetary Science that settled the argument. Using portable X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, Comelli's team analyzed the blade without removing it from the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The results? 10.8% nickel and 0.58% cobalt. That ratio is diagnostic. The dagger was made from a meteorite. Think about what that means. At the height of the New Kingdom, the richest and most powerful dynasty in Egyptian history, the most precious iron object in the pharaoh's tomb was space rock, not smelted, not forged from ore, found and shaped by hammering. That is how rare terrestrial iron was. The Boy King's dagger was made from a piece of the sky. Here is something most people get wrong about iron in the ancient world. You may have heard that the Hittites of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, had a monopoly on iron smelting and jealously guarded the secret for centuries. This story appears in dozens of popular history books. The narrative usually goes like this. The Hittites discovered iron smelting around 1500 BCE, kept it secret, and used iron weapons to dominate their neighbors. This is almost certainly not true. Ünsal Yalchin, an archaeometallurgist at the Deutsches Bergbau Museum in Bochum, Germany, published a comprehensive review in 2016 examining all available evidence for early Anatolian iron production. His conclusion? The evidence for a Hittite iron monopoly is vanishingly thin. The total number of iron artifacts found at Hittite sites is small, far too small to suggest industrial production. What the Hittites had was experimental knowledge. They could produce small amounts of iron, probably as a byproduct of copper smelting, and they treated it as a prestige material, rarer and more valuable than gold. The Amarna letters confirm this. In one tablet, the Egyptian pharaoh writes to the Hittite king requesting iron. The Hittite king responds, essentially, that iron is not currently available, and he will send some when production allows. That is not the language of a monopoly, that is the language of scarcity. Nobody in the late Bronze Age had mastered iron production. Not the Hittites, not the Egyptians, not the Mycenaeans. Everyone was experimenting. Nobody had scaled it. And then the world ended. Around 1177 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean fell apart. Eric H. Cline, an archaeologist and historian at George Washington University, published a book in 2014 called 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, that synthesized decades of archaeological evidence into a single devastating picture. Within roughly 50 years, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or suffered catastrophic decline. The Hittite Empire dissolved. Mycenaean palace complexes burned. The city of Ugarit was destroyed. And the last letter found in its ruins was still in the kiln, being fired into clay when the city fell. Egypt survived. Barely. Ramesses III fought off the Sea Peoples at the Battle of the Delta around 1178 BCE. The papyrus Harris I, the longest surviving papyrus from ancient Egypt, stretching over 40 meters, records his accomplishments, including that desperate victory. But the effort exhausted the new kingdom. Within a century, Egypt had fractured into competing power centers, and the centralized trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age for half a millennium were gone. Here is the part that matters. The tin trade collapsed. The routes that had carried tin from Afghanistan through the Levant to Egyptian smelters simply ceased to function. No tin meant no new bronze. No new bronze meant a crisis in weapons, tools, and infrastructure that no diplomatic letter could solve. Think about what that means for a civilization that built its entire material culture around a single alloy. Bernard Knapp of the University of Glasgow and Sturt Manning of Cornell University published research in 2016 documenting how the collapse of interregional trade forced communities across the Mediterranean to find local substitutes for imported materials. For tin, there was no substitute. But for the alloy that tin made possible, bronze, there was an alternative sitting in the hills, ignored for centuries: iron ore. Nobody chose iron because it was better. They chose it because they had no choice. The earliest smelted iron in the post-collapse world was terrible. It was soft, full of slag inclusions, and it could not hold an edge as well as good bronze. Jane Waldbaum, an archaeologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, published a landmark study in 1978 called From Bronze to Iron that demonstrated something most people still get wrong about this period. The transition from bronze to iron was not a technological upgrade. It was a materials crisis. Communities that had lost access to tin, especially across the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean, turned to local iron ores because those ores were everywhere. Iron is the fourth most abundant element in Earth's crust. There is more of it under your feet right now than there is gold in the entire ocean. You do not need a diplomatic relationship with a kingdom you have never visited. You need a hill with the right kind of reddish rock. That is not an advance. That is a retreat that accidentally opened a door. And the door led somewhere extraordinary. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what iron smelting actually involves, because it is not melting. Ancient smiths could not melt iron. Pure iron melts at 1,538 degrees Celsius, far beyond anything a charcoal-fired furnace could achieve. What they did instead was reduction. You pack iron ore, usually hematite or magnetite, into a small clay furnace with charcoal. You force air through it using bellows or ceramic tubes called tuyères. The charcoal burns, producing carbon monoxide, which strips the oxygen atoms from the iron oxide in the ore. What comes out is not a gleaming ingot. It is a spongy, slag-filled lump called a bloom. It looks like a charred rock. It looks nothing like a meteorite, nothing like bronze, nothing like any metal the smith has ever seen. Thilo Raren, an archaeometallurgist at University College London, published a study in 2013 in the journal Archaeometry, examining why early iron smelting was so wildly inconsistent. The bloom had to be reheated and hammered repeatedly to squeeze out the slag and consolidate the metal, a process called smithing. Every bloom was different. Every batch required judgment, not recipe. Think about what that means for an Egyptian metalworker trained in bronze casting. Pour metal into a mold, let it cool, done. Iron demanded the opposite. No mold, no casting, no predictability. Everything they knew was wrong. And then somebody made a mistake that changed the world. At some point, we do not know exactly when, and we do not know exactly where, a smith left a piece of iron in a charcoal fire for too long, hours too long. The carbon from the charcoal began to diffuse into the surface of the iron, atom by atom. The outer layer transformed. It became harder, much harder. It held an edge that pure iron never could. It did not bend under impact. That smith had accidentally invented steel. Ronald Tilecoat, a metallurgist at the University of Newcastle, published a book in 1992 called A History of Metallurgy that traced the development of carburization, the deliberate absorption of carbon into iron, from accidental discovery to controlled technique. The chemistry is simple in principle. Heat iron in direct contact with carbon long enough, and the carbon atoms migrate into the iron's crystal lattice. The result is a harder, stronger material that can take and hold a cutting edge. But here is what nobody tells you about early steel. The carburization only penetrates a few millimeters into the surface. The core of the blade stays soft iron. That means the earliest steel weapons had a hard cutting edge wrapped around a flexible core, which, by a spectacular accident of metallurgy, is exactly the combination you want in a sword blade. Hard enough to cut, flexible enough not to snap. That is not engineering. That is luck so extraordinary it reshaped civilization. Egypt came late to this revolution, but when the evidence finally appears, it appears in a place that rewrites the timeline. Pi-Ramesses, the great capital of Ramesses II in the eastern Nile Delta, was one of the largest cities in the ancient world during the 13th century BCE. It was the administrative heart of an empire, the launching point of military campaigns, the seat of a pharaoh whose name became synonymous with Egyptian power. In the 1990s, German archaeologist Anja Herold, working with the Römer und Pelizaeus Museum Hildesheim excavation team, uncovered something unexpected in a workshop district of Pi-Ramesses: industrial quantities of iron-smelting slag. Not scraps, not experimental debris, production waste. Thilo Raren, along with Thomas Belja and a team of specialists, published a detailed analysis in 2013 in the Journal of Archaeological Science examining the Pi-Ramesses slag, the iron content, the furnace remains, and the spatial distribution of debris indicated organized iron production, not at the scale of later Assyrian operations, but far beyond anything previously documented for New Kingdom Egypt. Think about what that means for how we tell the story of Egyptian iron. The standard narrative, that Egypt never developed iron technology and simply imported it, is wrong. By the end of the New Kingdom, Egyptians were smelting iron in the shadow of the pharaoh's own palace. They were late. They were behind the Levantine and Anatolian smiths who had been working iron for generations, but they were doing it. That is not imported technology. That is adaptation under pressure. And then iron stopped being rare. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, centered in modern-day northern Iraq, had industrialized iron production on a scale nobody had achieved before. John Curtis and Julian Reed of the British Museum published research in 1995 documenting vast Assyrian iron hoards at Khorsabad and Nimrud containing tons of iron implements: swords, spearheads, armor scales, helmets, sickle blades, agricultural tools. Here is something most people get wrong about ancient military technology. The advantage of iron weapons over bronze weapons was not hardness. Good bronze is comparable to mediocre iron. A well-cast bronze sword will outperform a poorly forged iron one any day. The advantage was supply. Bronze requires two relatively rare materials: copper and tin, sourced from different locations, transported along vulnerable trade routes, and combined in precise proportions. Iron requires one abundant ore from one local source. A provincial commander with a furnace and a charcoal supply can arm a garrison without waiting for a shipment from 1,000 kilometers away. You can equip 1,000 soldiers with iron for what it would cost to equip 100 with bronze. That is not a quality revolution. That is a quantity revolution. And in ancient warfare, quantity wins. Sound familiar? Every arms race in human history runs on the same logic. The weapon that prevails is not the best one. It is the one you can produce enough of. Egypt's transition was slower than the Levant's, slower than Assyria's, slower than Greece's. The reasons are straightforward. Egypt still had copper. The Sinai mines continued producing into the first millennium BCE. Egyptian bronze working traditions were among the oldest and most refined anywhere in the world. The institutional knowledge, the foundries, the craftsmen, the generations of accumulated expertise, all favored bronze. Administrative records from the Third Intermediate Period and the Late Period show iron gradually appearing in workshop inventories and tool accounts. At Deir el-Medina, the workers' village that had served the royal tomb builders for over 400 years, the archaeological record shows iron tools, slowly supplementing and eventually replacing bronze ones across several generations. Ostraca, limestone flakes used as everyday writing material, document the distribution of metal tools to workers, and the shift from bronze to iron entries is visible across the records. A workman named Neferhotep, known from Ostraca dating to the late 20th dynasty, appears in records receiving copper tools. A generation later, the same types of distribution entries specify iron. That was not a revolution. That was a slow surrender. Bronze held on in Egypt longer than almost anywhere else in the Mediterranean, a testament not to backwardness, but to how well the old system had worked. The final push came from the sea. Around 620 BCE, Pharaoh Ramesses II granted Greek traders a permanent commercial settlement at Naucratis in the western Nile Delta. Flinders Petrie, the founder of systematic Egyptian archaeology, excavated Naucratis in 1884 and 1885, uncovering evidence of a thriving port where Greek, Egyptian, and Phoenician merchants exchanged goods, including finished iron tools and raw iron stock. By this period, Greek iron technology had advanced well beyond Egyptian capabilities. Greek smiths had developed more efficient bellows-driven furnaces, better control of carburization, and established supply chains that moved iron across the entire Mediterranean. Here is the irony that tells the whole story. For 2,000 years, Egypt had exported civilization. Egyptian engineering, Egyptian medicine, Egyptian administrative systems had shaped every culture that encountered them. And now at the end of that long arc, Egypt was importing the one technology that would define the next age of human history. The civilization that built the pyramids with copper tools was buying iron from Greek traders at a port in the Delta. That is approximately what happened to the Eastern Mediterranean. But iron's greatest transformation was not military. It was agricultural. Louise Isles and Marcos Martinon Torres, archaeometallurgists at University College London, published research in 2016 in the journal Azania documenting how iron tools, hoes, sickle blades, plowshares, mattocks, transformed farming across Africa and the Mediterranean from the first millennium BCE onward. Bronze agricultural tools had existed, but they were expensive enough that most Egyptian farmers worked with stone and wood well into the late Bronze Age. A copper hoe was a valuable possession, not a disposable tool. Iron changed that equation permanently. Iron ore is everywhere. Smelting requires only clay for a furnace, charcoal for fuel, and bellows for air. A village blacksmith working a simple pit furnace could produce iron tools for local farmers at a fraction of what bronze cost. Think about what that means for the story of iron. For For 3,000 years, iron had been celestial, rare, precious, divine. Meteorites were gifts from the gods. Tutankhamun's dagger was a treasure beyond price, and now the same metal was in the hands of a farmer in the Fayum, cutting through Nile silt to plant emmer wheat. That is what iron did to human civilization. It stopped being sacred and started being useful. It moved from the pharaoh's tomb to the farmer's field, from the sky to the soil. And the chain never broke. In 1856, Henry Bessemer patented a process for blowing air through molten pig iron to burn off excess carbon, producing mild steel cheaply and at industrial scale for the first time in history. Mas, the Bessemer process did to the 19th century what iron smelting had done to the Bronze Age. It made the strong material cheap enough for everyone. Today, global crude steel production exceeds 1.8 billion metric tons per year. Steel is the skeleton of every bridge, every skyscraper, every car, every surgical instrument, every shipping container crossing every ocean. It is iron with carbon. The same combination an anonymous ancient smith stumbled into by leaving a bloom in a charcoal fire too long, somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, over 3,000 years ago. From meteorite to bloom to Bessemer converter to the steel beam above your head, the chain is unbroken. So here is the answer. How did ancient Egyptians discover iron? They did it in layers, across 3,000 years, and mostly against their will. First, they found it in meteorites, dense metallic rocks lying on the desert surface after falling from space. They hammered these fragments into beads and blades, strung them alongside gold, and called the metal Bi-in-pe, iron of the sky. They had no idea the same material existed in the ground beneath their sandals. Then they built the most successful bronze-working civilization in the ancient Mediterranean. So successful that iron was not just unnecessary, but unthinkable. They had copper from Sinai, tin from Afghanistan, and a system of casting and recycling that worked brilliantly for over 1,000 years. Then that system collapsed. Around 1177 BCE, the trade networks that carried tin across the known world fell apart. The Hittite Empire dissolved, cities burned, and Egypt, though it survived, lost the supply chain that made bronze possible. Then communities across the eastern Mediterranean, desperate for any usable metal, turned to the iron ore that had been sitting in their hills all along. They built small furnaces, produced ugly spongy blooms, and hammered out crude tools that were worse than the bronze they replaced. Then someone left iron in a charcoal fire too long. Carbon diffused into the surface, and they accidentally invented steel, a material harder than bronze, made from the most abundant metal ore on Earth. Then Egypt built its own forges at Pi-Ramesses. Then iron went to war with the Assyrians. Then it went to the farm. Then Henry Bessemer made steel cheap enough to build the modern world with. And now every building you have ever entered is held together by the same metal that once fell from the sky. Was this inevitable? Almost certainly. Iron is the fourth most abundant element in Earth's crust. Iron ore appears on every continent. The reduction chemistry, heating iron oxide with carbon to strip the oxygen, is simple enough that any civilization with charcoal and a sufficiently hot fire would eventually stumble into it. The probability that humans would discover how to smelt iron is roughly 95%. But the timing was an accident. Iron arrived in Egypt not through Egyptian genius, but through catastrophe. Through the collapse of everything that made bronze possible. You are surrounded by iron right now. The frame of the building you are sitting in, the car you drove today, the bridge you crossed this morning, the knife in your kitchen drawer, the rebar inside every concrete slab on every sidewalk in every city on Earth. Steel is iron. Stainless steel is iron. The surgical pin holding a stranger's knee together 2 floors below you in a hospital. That is iron. And all of it traces back to the same chain. A meteorite fell in the Egyptian desert. Someone picked it up and called it a gift from the sky. For 3,000 years, that was all iron was. Celestial, rare, sacred, divine. Then the trade routes collapsed, and bronze became impossible. And a metal that had been miraculous became the only option left. Then a smith made a mistake with a charcoal fire, and the mistake turned out to be the most important accident in the history of materials science. Iron did not arrive because somebody was looking for it. It arrived because everything else failed. That is the pattern. Not invention, not genius, pressure, accident, and the long, blind accumulation of time. The meteorite did not choose to fall. The tin trade did not choose to collapse. The smith did not choose to leave the iron in the fire too long. And yet here you are, in a building made of steel, living inside the consequences of a rock that fell from the sky 5,000 years ago. They did not know what they were holding, but they picked it up anyway